The November rain drummed against the stained glass windows of St. Catherine's Cathedral as Margaret Whitmore stood alone in the back pew. Her simple black dress a stark contrast to the elaborate designer mourning attire that filled the front rows. She watched her late husband's family display their grief like expensive jewelry, each tear seemingly calculated for maximum dramatic effect. Before we continue with Margaret's story, I'm curious about something. Where are you watching this from today? Whether you're dealing with your own complicated family dynamics or just appreciate a good story about hidden strength, I'd love to know what part of the world is following along. Drop a comment and let me know your location. Edmund Whitmore, the family patriarch at 78, commanded the front pew like a throne. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early morning service, and his charcoal suit probably cost more than most people earned in 6 months. He had built the Whitmore real estate empire from a single apartment building into a sprawling network of commercial properties, luxury developments, and investment portfolios worth over $50 million. Beside him sat his daughter Vivian Charleston, whose red-rimmed eyes seemed more focused on the potential inheritance than actual sorrow. At 45, she had maintained her appearance through a series of expensive procedures that left her looking perpetually surprised. Her black Chanel suit hugged her surgically enhanced figure, and she dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than Margaret's entire outfit. Richard Whitmore, Edmund's eldest son at 52, stood to deliver the eulogy. His deep voice carried across the cathedral as he spoke about family legacy, business acumen, and the importance of keeping wealth within bloodlines. Margaret noticed how he carefully avoided mentioning her 15-year marriage to his father, instead focusing on achievements that predated their relationship. The service concluded with military precision. As mourners filed out, Margaret found herself surrounded by whispered conversations about property divisions and asset valuations. She recognized many faces from family gatherings where she had been politely tolerated but never truly accepted. These were people who had benefited from her late husband's generosity, attended parties and homes she had helped finance, and built careers on foundations she had quietly strengthened. Edmund approached her near the cathedral steps, his pale blue eyes cold despite the supposed grief. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in boardrooms, "I need to speak with you about practical matters. The family will be gathering tomorrow morning for the reading of James's will. I think it would be best if you made other arrangements." Margaret looked up at him calmly. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple chignon, and at 58, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that had always unnerved the more flamboyant family members. "Other arrangements," she repeated softly. "I see." Vivian stepped closer, her heels clicking against the wet stone. "Let's be honest here, Margaret. You were a lovely companion for Daddy James in his later years, but this is about family legacy now. Real family. The businesses, the properties, the investments, they've been in Whitmore hands for 3 generations. I'm sure James left you something appropriate for your years of service." Richard nodded in agreement, adjusting his expensive watch. "Mother," he said, though Margaret had never asked him to call her that, "you have to understand the complexity of what we're dealing with. Corporate structures, investment partnerships, real estate holdings that require intimate knowledge of the business. These aren't things that can be explained easily to someone without background in finance." Margaret listened to their words while her mind wandered to memories they didn't share. She remembered the late nights spent reviewing property acquisition documents, the careful analysis of market trends that had guided their investment decisions, the phone calls with architects and contractors during the renovation of their Beacon Hill mansion. She thought about the offshore accounts established to minimize tax exposure, the corporate restructuring that had protected assets during the 2008 financial crisis, the international investment portfolios that had diversified their holdings across 4 continents. "I understand," she said simply. "Tomorrow morning, then." As the family dispersed to their luxury vehicles, Margaret noticed Harrison Blackwell lingering near the cathedral entrance. The family attorney for over 20 years, he had always been polite but distant during her interactions with the family's legal affairs. Today, however, he seemed unable to meet her eyes directly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, approaching her with obvious reluctance. "I wanted to express my condolences personally. Your husband was a remarkable man." "Thank you, Harrison," Margaret replied. "I appreciate your kindness over the years." He shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing toward where Edmund was speaking animatedly with Richard beside a black Mercedes. "The reading tomorrow," he began, then stopped. "I want you to know that I've always admired your grace in difficult circumstances." Margaret studied his face carefully. She had learned to read people during her years in the family, recognizing the subtle signs of discomfort that preceded important revelations. "That's very kind of you to say." Harrison cleared his throat. "The will is straightforward, as these things go. But there are always complexities with estates of this size. Property deeds, corporate ownership structures, investment accounts. Sometimes documentation requires careful review." "Of course," Margaret said. "I wouldn't expect anything less than thoroughness." As Harrison walked away, Margaret remained on the cathedral steps watching the family convoy disappear into Boston traffic. The rain had intensified, and most mourners had departed, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the weight of 15 years spent watching this moment approach. She thought about the family's confidence, their casual dismissal of her role, their assumption that legal documents would simply confirm what they believed to be natural law. She remembered other family gatherings where business was discussed around her, as if she were invisible, where financial decisions were debated without acknowledgement of her input, where her suggestions were politely ignored until they proved profitable months later. The irony wasn't lost on her that some of the properties they would inherit tomorrow were ones she had identified as investment opportunities. The commercial building in Cambridge that had tripled in value, the waterfront development in Marblehead that had become their most profitable holding, the office complex in Burlington that provided steady rental income, all had been her recommendations during quiet evening conversations with James. Margaret pulled her coat tighter against the November chill and walked toward her modest Honda Civic. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would shock the family, but tonight she would honor her husband's memory in her own way. She had loved James Whitmore despite his family's treatment, had supported his dreams even when they conflicted with her own, and had built something together that transcended their individual contributions. The drive home to their Beacon Hill townhouse took her past several properties the family would claim as inheritance. Each building held memories of late-night planning sessions, weekend site visits, and careful financial calculations that had turned James's modest family wealth into something extraordinary. Margaret had been there for every decision, every risk, every triumph that had built the empire Edmund was so eager to control. As she pulled into her driveway, Margaret noticed the real estate sign that had been planted on the front lawn. Apparently, the family had already made assumptions about her living arrangements as well. She smiled to herself, thinking about the surprise that awaited them in Harrison's office tomorrow morning, when certain legal documents would require much more careful examination than anyone anticipated. The Whitmore family library had been designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that few had ever opened, but everyone admired. Oriental rugs worth more than luxury cars covered the polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings of stern-faced Whitmore ancestors gazed down from their gilded frames as if presiding over the morning's proceedings. Margaret arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, as requested. She wore the same simple black dress from the funeral, her only concession to formality being a small string of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. The family was already assembled, having clearly arrived early to coordinate their presentation. Edmund sat behind the massive desk that had belonged to his grandfather, the original Whitmore patriarch who had started with a single tenement building in South Boston. Vivian had chosen a navy blue designer suit that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly living expenses. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves that caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows, and she wore jewelry that sparkled with each calculated gesture. Richard stood near the fireplace in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his Harvard Law School ring catching the light as he adjusted his platinum watch. Harrison Blackwell entered carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than Margaret herself. Behind him walked a woman Margaret didn't recognize, a professional-looking blonde in her early 40s carrying a notary stamp and several manila folders thick with documentation. "Everyone, please take your seats," Harrison announced. "This is Patricia Jenkins, our certified notary, who will be witnessing today's proceedings and ensuring all legal requirements are properly met." Patricia nodded politely to the room. She wore a conservative black pantsuit and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had overseen countless estate readings. Her presence seemed to add an extra layer of formality to proceedings that were already thick with tension and expectation. Edmund gestured toward a single chair positioned several feet from the main family grouping. "Margaret, you may sit there." The seating arrangement spoke volumes about family hierarchy. Edmund maintained his position behind the desk like a judge, while Vivian and Richard occupied the two leather chairs directly in front of him. Margaret's isolated chair faced the family rather than the attorney, making her feel more like a defendant than a beneficiary. Harrison opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency. The last will and testament of James Edmund Whitmore, executed on March 15th of this year, he began, his voice carrying the weight of legal tradition. James was very specific about his intentions for the disposition of his estate. Margaret noticed how the family leaned forward in anticipation. Vivian's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension despite her confident exterior. Richard maintained his composed expression, but a muscle in his jaw twitched slightly as Harrison shuffled through the documents. The estate consists of numerous holdings, Harrison continued. The primary residence at Beacon Hill, valued at approximately $4.8 million. The vacation property in Martha's Vineyard, valued at $2.1 million. Commercial real estate holdings including the Cambridge office building, the Marblehead waterfront development, and the Burlington commercial complex, with combined valuations exceeding $15 million. As Harrison listed each property, Margaret could see the family mentally calculating their shares. Edmund's face remained impassive, but his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the formal transfer of power that would cement his control over the family empire for the next generation. Corporate holdings include majority stakes in Whitmore Development Corporation, Whitmore Property Management, and Whitmore Investment Partners, Harrison said. Combined business valuations exceed $22 million. Investment portfolios, including domestic and international holdings, are valued at approximately $8.6 million. Vivian couldn't suppress a small smile. The numbers were even larger than she had dared hope. Her expensive lifestyle, her children's private school educations, her plans for European vacations and luxury renovations, all were now financially secure for generations. Richard maintained his lawyer's composure, but Margaret noticed his breathing had become slightly deeper. As the eldest son, he had always assumed he would inherit the business operations. Now that assumption was becoming legal reality. "Now for the specific bequests," Harrison said, his voice becoming more careful. "To Margaret Whitmore, my beloved wife, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my personal effects, in recognition of her devoted companionship during our marriage." The silence that followed was deafening. $50,000 from an estate worth over $50 million was less than 1%. Margaret felt the family's eyes on her, waiting for reaction, hoping for tears or protests that would justify their treatment of her. Instead, she simply nodded. "Thank you, Harrison." Edmund cleared his throat with obvious satisfaction. "To my son Richard, I leave 40% of all business holdings, 30% of real estate investments, and the vacation property in Martha's Vineyard. To my daughter Vivian, I leave 35% of all business holdings, 40% of real estate investments, and the primary residence at Beacon Hill. The remaining percentages," Harrison continued, "are to be divided between my grandchildren in trust, managed by Edmund Whitmore as executor until they reach the age of 25. Vivian couldn't contain herself any longer. "Oh, thank goodness," she breathed. "I was so worried about maintaining the house. The property taxes alone are nearly $60,000 a year, and I couldn't bear the thought of having to sell it." Richard stepped forward to shake his grandfather's hand. "This ensures the business legacy continues properly," he said. "James would have wanted the companies to remain under family control." Edmund rose from behind the desk, his satisfaction evident. "James was wise to structure things this way," he announced. "It keeps everything in proper hands. People who understand the responsibilities that come with this kind of wealth." Margaret remained seated, watching the family celebration with quiet dignity. She had expected this outcome, had prepared herself emotionally for this moment of public dismissal. What she hadn't expected was the look of discomfort on Harrison's face as he gathered the documents. Vivian turned toward Margaret with poorly concealed triumph. I hope you understand, Margaret, this isn't personal. It's about preserving what's been built over generations. Family legacy means responsibility to blood relations. Of course, Margaret replied calmly. I understand completely. Patricia Jenkins had been taking notes throughout the reading, her pen moving steadily across legal forms that would make the transfers official. However, as Harrison prepared to close his briefcase, she cleared her throat politely. Excuse me, Mr. Blackwell, she said, her voice professional but concerned. Before we finalize these transfers, I need to verify something. These properties being transferred, I noticed several require additional documentation for clear title transfer. Harrison paused, his hand on the briefcase clasp. Additional documentation. Patricia opened one of her manila folders. Yes, for properties where there are multiple signatories on original purchase agreements, or where co-ownership exists, we need verification of all parties' consent for transfer. It's standard procedure, but essential for legal validity. The family's celebration mood shifted slightly. Edmund frowned. What kind of verification? Patricia consulted her notes. Well, for instance, several of these properties show dual signatures on the original deeds. When properties are purchased with joint financial contribution or joint credit qualification, both parties typically maintain legal interest even if only one name appears on common documentation. Margaret spoke for the first time since the reading began. I believe that's standard practice, isn't it? When married couples purchase property together. Harrison's discomfort was now obvious. Yes, well, in some cases there might be complexities. Patricia, what specifically are you seeing that requires additional review? Patricia spread several documents across Edmund's desk. The Beacon Hill property, for example. The original purchase documentation from 18 years ago shows 2 signatures on the mortgage application, 2 credit checks, and 2 income verifications. The Cambridge commercial building has similar dual documentation. The Martha's Vineyard property purchase shows joint investment funding from multiple accounts. Vivian's confidence wavered slightly. But surely the will supersedes any of that, she said. If James left me the house, then I inherit the house. Patricia shook her head politely. Not necessarily. If Mrs. Margaret Whitmore has legal ownership interest based on financial contribution or co-signature, then her consent would be required for any transfer. The will can only distribute what the deceased actually owned individually. Richard stepped forward, his legal training kicking in. This is ridiculous. My father owned those properties for decades. We have the deeds. Patricia nodded. Yes, but deeds sometimes show primary ownership while other documents establish co-ownership rights. It's more common than people realize, especially with married couples who make joint purchases. I need to examine all original purchase documents, mortgage applications, and investment records before I can notarize these transfers. Harrison closed his briefcase with a decisive snap. Very well. We'll need 48 hours to gather all supporting documentation. Margaret, would you be available for a follow-up meeting to review any documents where your signature appears? Margaret smiled serenely. Of course, Harrison. I want to make sure everything is handled properly according to the law. Edmund's face had darkened considerably. This is highly irregular, he said. These properties have been family holdings for decades. Patricia gathered her papers efficiently. Mr. Whitmore, irregularities in estate transfers can create legal complications that last for years. It's much better to verify everything properly now than to face challenges later. As the meeting concluded, Margaret noticed the dramatic shift in family dynamics. The triumphant celebration had transformed into worried whispers. Vivian was asking Richard about property law complications, while Edmund was demanding explanations from Harrison about documentation they had never considered important. Margaret rose from her isolated chair and approached Patricia. Thank you for your thoroughness, she said quietly. I appreciate your attention to proper legal procedures. Patricia looked at her with professional respect. Mrs. Whitmore, in my experience, complex estates often have complex ownership structures. It's important that everyone understands their actual legal positions before any transfers take place. As Margaret left the Whitmore mansion, she could hear the family's increasingly agitated discussion through the library's tall windows. Their confident morning had transformed into an afternoon of uncertainty. and she suspected the next 48 hours would bring revelations that would change their understanding of the Whitmore family empire forever. The law offices of Blackwell and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a granite building that had housed Boston legal practices since the 1920s. At 9:30 that evening, only 2 offices remained illuminated against the November darkness. In the largest conference room, Harrison Blackwell and Patricia Jenkins had transformed the mahogany table into a landscape of manila folders, legal documents, and computer printouts that told a story neither had expected to discover. Harrison rubbed his tired eyes and reached for his 4th cup of coffee. In 32 years of estate law, he had never encountered documentation that so completely contradicted his assumptions about a family's financial structure. Patricia sat across from him, her laptop open to bank records that dated back over 2 decades, methodically cross-referencing signatures and account numbers with a precision that had already uncovered 3 major discrepancies. "Look at this again," Patricia said, sliding a yellowed document across the table. Original purchase agreement for the Cambridge office building, dated September 1998. 2 signatures on the buyer line, 2 credit checks attached, 2 income verification forms. Harrison studied the paperwork that he had reviewed dozens of times over the years without truly examining. James Edmund Whitmore's familiar signature occupied the primary buyer line, bold and confident, as always. Below it, in smaller but equally clear handwriting, was a second signature that read Margaret Catherine Sullivan. Sullivan was her maiden name, Patricia continued. This purchase predates their marriage by almost 2 years. She wasn't even Margaret Whitmore yet when she co-signed this deal. Harrison turned to the attached financial documentation. Margaret Sullivan's income verification showed employment as a senior financial analyst with Meridian Investment Group, with an annual salary that had been substantial even by 1998 standards. More significantly, her credit check revealed liquid assets exceeding $800,000, money that appeared to have been inherited from her late parents' pharmaceutical patents. She had serious money before she ever met James, Harrison murmured, scanning the credit report details. Investment accounts, treasury bonds, real estate holdings in Vermont that she sold to help fund this Cambridge purchase. Patricia opened her laptop and pulled up bank records that she had spent 3 hours obtaining from First National Bank's archives. "Here's what really gets interesting," she said, turning the screen toward Harrison. "Joint business checking account for Whitmore Development Corporation, established in 1999. Margaret's signature appears on every major deposit, every significant withdrawal, every business loan application." The bank signature cards told a story that contradicted 15 years of family assumptions. Margaret Catherine Sullivan Whitmore wasn't listed as an authorized user or secondary signer. She was designated as co-owner and primary financial officer, with full authority over corporate accounts that managed millions of dollars in real estate transactions. Harrison pulled out his phone and called the bank's after-hours verification line. "Yes, this is Harrison Blackwell representing the Whitmore estate. I need to confirm account ownership structure for business accounts dating back to 1999. Account numbers are..." He read a series of numbers while Patricia continued her document review. While Harrison was on hold, Patricia discovered something that made her pause. She opened a thick folder labeled Insurance Policies and began reading through life insurance documentation that the family had never questioned. The primary policy on James Whitmore's life, worth $2.4 million, listed Margaret as sole beneficiary. More importantly, the policy had been purchased with funds from Margaret's personal investment account. "Harrison," Patricia said softly, interrupting his phone conversation. "You need to see this." He put the bank on speakerphone and leaned over to examine the insurance documents. The policy application, dated 2001, included a financial declaration section that revealed Margaret's net worth at the time exceeded James's by almost $300,000. She had insured his life using her own assets, apparently to protect business investments that relied heavily on his active management. The bank representative returned to the call. "Mr. Blackwell, I've reviewed the account structures you requested. Margaret Whitmore is listed as primary account holder on 4 business accounts, with James Whitmore as secondary. The accounts were established using her initial capital investment of $1.2 million, with ongoing contributions from both parties over the years. Harrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. Primary account holder, he repeated. Yes, sir. She maintains full legal authority over business operations, loan applications, and asset distributions. Mr. James Whitmore was authorized to conduct day-to-day transactions, but major financial decisions required her signature or direct authorization. Patricia was already pulling up additional documents on her laptop. Property tax records for the last 15 years, she announced. Guess whose personal checking account has been paying the property taxes on the Beacon Hill Mansion, the Martha's Vineyard House, and all 3 commercial properties? Harrison thanked the bank representative and ended the call. He walked to the conference room's tall windows and stared down at the empty Boston streets below. The family he had represented for 2 decades, the business empire he had helped structure legally, the inheritance distributions he had just attempted to formalize, all were built on a foundation he had never properly examined. She funded everything, he said quietly. Not just some of it. Everything. Patricia nodded, scrolling through investment account records that painted an even more complex picture. Margaret's portfolio management showed systematic transfers of funds to support Whitmore business ventures, real estate acquisitions, and expansion projects. She had essentially operated as the silent partner in a family empire that had never acknowledged her role. The Marblehead waterfront development, Patricia said, reading from a thick file. Initial investment capital came from Margaret's liquidated Vermont properties. The Burlington commercial complex was financed through her business line of credit. The Martha's Vineyard house was purchased with funds from her parents' patent royalty trust. Harrison returned to his chair and opened another folder he had been avoiding. The recent will modification that had reduced Margaret's inheritance to $50,000. James had updated his will in March, just 6 months before his death. The modification removed Margaret from business ownership and property inheritance, transferring everything to blood relatives instead. Patricia, he said slowly, if Margaret has legal co-ownership of all these properties and businesses, can James even distribute them through his will without her consent? Patricia was quiet for several minutes, reading through property law precedents on her laptop. Based on Massachusetts property law, she finally said, if Margaret can prove financial contribution to property acquisition, ongoing financial support for property maintenance, and co-signature on original purchase agreements, then James could only will away his portion of jointly owned assets. Which means, Harrison said, understanding the implications, the will I read this morning might not be legally valid for the majority of the estate. Patricia pulled up a mortgage document that made both lawyers freeze. The original mortgage application for the Beacon Hill Mansion, dated 2003. James's income alone hadn't qualified for the loan amount. Margaret's additional income, combined with her excellent credit history and substantial down payment contribution, had made the purchase possible. Harrison, she said quietly, Margaret didn't just co-sign this mortgage. She qualified the family for a house they couldn't otherwise afford. The 2 lawyers worked in silence for another hour, discovering layer after layer of Margaret's financial involvement in the Whitmore empire. Investment partnerships where her capital had funded expansion. Business loans where her credit had guaranteed approval. Property acquisitions where her inherited wealth had provided down payments. At 11:45, Harrison's phone rang. Edmund Whitmore's voice was sharp with irritation. Harrison, I want this documentation review completed immediately. The family is facing significant planning decisions that require clarity about asset distribution. We cannot have our business operations disrupted by administrative delays. Edmund, Harrison said carefully, the review has uncovered some complexities that require additional examination. I recommend we schedule another meeting for day after tomorrow to discuss our findings. Complexities, Edmund repeated. What kinds of complexities? Legal questions about joint ownership and property rights, Harrison replied. Nothing that can't be resolved, but we need to ensure everything is handled properly. After ending the call, Patricia looked across the document-covered table at Harrison. She's been extraordinarily patient, considering what we're discovering here, Patricia observed. Most people would be demanding immediate answers. Harrison nodded, thinking about Margaret's calm demeanor during that morning's uncomfortable will reading. She had accepted the family's dismissive treatment without protest, had agreed to additional legal review without complaint, had maintained dignity despite obvious humiliation. She knows, doesn't she? Patricia said. She knows exactly what these documents show. Harrison suspected Patricia was right. Margaret's serene acceptance of legal delays, her willingness to cooperate with document review, her lack of surprise at Patricia's questions about joint ownership, all suggested someone who understood the true legal situation far better than anyone realized. The two lawyers continued their review until well past midnight, discovering that Margaret's financial fingerprints were embedded throughout every major business decision, property acquisition, and investment strategy that had built the Whitmore fortune. Tomorrow's meeting would reveal to the family that their assumed inheritance was built on a foundation they had never acknowledged, funded by a woman they had never respected, and legally controlled by someone they had dismissed as irrelevant. Harrison gathered the most significant documents into a separate folder, preparing for conversations that would shatter the family's understanding of their own empire. Patricia closed her laptop and collected her notes, knowing that tomorrow would bring revelations that would permanently alter the power dynamics in one of Boston's wealthiest families. As they turned off the conference room lights and prepared to leave, both lawyers understood they were holding evidence that would transform Margaret from excluded widow to recognized architect of the very fortune from which she had been dismissed. The call came at 7:30 in the morning. Edmund's voice carried none of his usual commanding authority as he summoned the family to an emergency meeting at the Beacon Hill mansion. Vivian arrived first, her usually perfect appearance showing signs of a sleepless night. Her blonde hair was pulled back hastily, and she wore minimal makeup, revealing the stress lines that expensive cosmetics usually concealed. Richard followed 20 minutes later, his tie slightly askew and his normally immaculate appearance suggesting he had dressed in haste. They gathered in the same library where yesterday's confidential reading had taken place, but the atmosphere had transformed completely. Edmund paced behind the massive desk where he had presided so smugly just 24 hours earlier, his silver hair disheveled from running his hands through it repeatedly. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed harsh rather than elegant, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny harbingers of uncertainty. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Edmund announced without preamble. "I spoke with Harrison last night, and he's creating delays where none should exist. We're talking about straightforward property transfers that have been in Whitmore hands for decades." Vivian clutched her coffee cup with both hands, seeking warmth and comfort in the familiar ritual. "What exactly did he tell you?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual confident edge. "You said there were complexities, but what does that actually mean for us?" Edmund stopped pacing and turned toward his children with an expression that mixed fury with something approaching panic. "He's talking about joint ownership issues, co-signature requirements, and something about Margaret having legal claims to properties we've owned as a family since before she existed in our lives." Richard straightened in his leather chair, his legal training engaging despite his personal investment in the outcome. "Joint ownership claims are serious," he said slowly. "If Margaret can prove financial contribution to property acquisition, she might have legitimate co-ownership rights regardless of whose name appears on common documentation." "That's ridiculous," Vivian snapped, her composure cracking visibly. She was Daddy James's second wife for 15 years. She didn't build anything, didn't contribute anything meaningful to the business. She was essentially a Livian companion who happened to have a marriage certificate. Edmund resumed his pacing, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor with increasing agitation. "That's exactly what I told Harrison, but he keeps mentioning original purchase documents, mortgage applications, and bank signature cards. Apparently, Patricia Jenkins wants to examine every piece of paperwork from the last 2 decades. Richard pulled out his phone and began searching legal precedent databases with the focused intensity he usually reserved for his own law practice. "Massachusetts property law recognizes several forms of joint ownership," he read aloud. "If Margaret can demonstrate financial contribution through down payments, mortgage qualification, or ongoing property maintenance, she could have claims ranging from partial ownership to complete co-ownership depending on the extent of her involvement." Vivian set down her coffee cup with enough force to rattle the saucer. "This is Margaret we're talking about," she said, her voice rising with frustration. "The woman who spent 15 years organizing charity luncheons and redecorating rooms. She doesn't know anything about real estate law or business operations. How could she possibly have legal claims to properties worth tens of millions of dollars? Edmund stopped pacing and faced his children with a grim expression. That's what we need to find out, he said. I want everything we can discover about Margaret's background before she married your stepfather. Her finances, her investments, her family wealth, everything that might explain why these lawyers are treating her like she has legitimate legal standing. Richard was already making notes on his phone. I can have my research team pull public records, credit histories, and property ownership documentation going back to the 1980s, he said. If there's something in her background that supports these ownership claims, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Vivian had moved to the tall windows and stood staring out at the carefully manicured garden that she had been planning to redesign as soon as the house became legally hers. What if we're missing something obvious? She said quietly. What if Margaret has been more involved in family finances than we realized? The suggestion hung in the air like an uncomfortable truth that none of them wanted to acknowledge. For 15 years, they had dismissed Margaret as irrelevant to the family's business operations, but their dismissal had been based on assumption rather than actual knowledge of her role. Edmund's phone rang, interrupting the family's increasingly anxious speculation. Harrison's voice was carefully neutral when Edmund answered on speakerphone. Edmund, I wanted to update you on our document review progress. Patricia and I worked until midnight examining property records, and we've discovered some information that requires careful consideration. What kind of information? Edmund demanded, his voice sharp with impatience. There's a pause, then Harrison's measured response. Margaret's financial involvement in family property acquisitions appears to be more extensive than anyone realized. We're finding her signature on original purchase agreements, mortgage applications, and business loan documentation dating back to the late 1990s. Vivian and Richard exchanged glances of growing concern. The late 1990s preceded Margaret's marriage to their father by several years, which meant her financial involvement had deeper roots than they had ever imagined. Harrison continued, his professional tone unable to disguise the gravity of what he was revealing. Her income and credit history appear to have been essential for qualifying for several major property purchases, including the Cambridge office building and the original mortgage on your current residence. That's impossible, Edmund said flatly. James owned the Cambridge building for decades. It was one of his first major investments. According to the original purchase documentation, Harrison replied carefully, the property was acquired through a joint purchase agreement between James and Margaret Sullivan, using combined financial resources from both parties. Margaret's contribution included both down payment funds and income qualification for the commercial mortgage. Richard was frantically taking notes while Vivian had gone pale, understanding the implications even without legal training. If Margaret had been financially essential for major property acquisitions, her legal claims to those properties would be substantial regardless of how the family had perceived her role over the years. Edmund's voice became dangerously quiet. Are you telling me that Margaret has legal ownership rights to properties we've considered family holdings for decades? Harrison's response was measured but devastating. I'm telling you that we need to complete our review before making any determinations about property transfer. Based on what we've discovered so far, Margaret's consent would likely be required for transferring properties where she has co-ownership interests. After ending the call, the three family members sat in stunned silence. The library that had witnessed their triumphant inheritance celebration just one day earlier now felt like the scene of a potential financial catastrophe that none of them had seen coming. Vivian was the first to break the silence. How did we not know this? She whispered. How did we spend 15 years in the same family without understanding that Margaret might legally own half of everything we thought was ours? Richard closed his laptop with a decisive snap. We assumed, he said grimly. We assumed that because Margaret never asserted herself in family discussions, because she never demanded recognition for business contributions, because she seemed content to remain in the background, that she was legally irrelevant to our financial structure. Edmund had aged visibly during the phone conversation. The commanding patriarch who had presided over family affairs for decades suddenly looked like an elderly man facing the collapse of assumptions that had defined his understanding of family wealth and power. What happens if the review confirms that Margaret has substantial ownership rights? Vivian asked, though she seemed afraid to hear the answer. Richard's legal expertise provided clarity that none of them wanted. If Margaret has co-ownership of the properties and businesses, then James could only will away his portion of jointly owned assets. The will I heard yesterday might be legally invalid for most of the estate. The family spent the remainder of the morning making increasingly frantic phone calls to financial advisors, estate planning attorneys, and property law specialists, seeking opinions about their legal position. Each conversation confirmed their growing fear that their assumed inheritance was built on sand. By afternoon, Margaret had called Harrison to schedule a meeting for reviewing any additional documentation that required her attention. Her voice was calm and cooperative, expressing only interest in ensuring that all legal requirements were properly met according to Massachusetts law. Edmund, Vivian, and Richard gathered again in the library as evening approached, their day of research having revealed nothing that weakened Margaret's potential claims and everything that strengthened them. Margaret Sullivan Whitmore had arrived in their family with substantial inherited wealth, impressive financial credentials, and investment experience that she had never felt compelled to discuss or defend. The woman they had dismissed as irrelevant was emerging as potentially the most financially powerful member of their family, and tomorrow's meeting would determine whether their comfortable assumptions about inherited wealth would survive contact with legal reality. The conference room at Blackwell & Associates had been reconfigured for what Harrison privately considered the most significant estate meeting of his career. The mahogany table now accommodated not just the immediate family, but also Robert Chun, the forensic accountant Edmund had hired overnight, and Diana Morrison, the property law specialist Richard had flown in from New York specifically to protect family interests. Margaret arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, wearing the same simple black dress that had become her uniform for family legal proceedings. She carried only a small leather purse and maintained the serene composure that had characterized her behavior throughout the increasingly tense week. Patricia Jenkins was already seated at the head of the table, her laptop connected to a large monitor that would display the documentation she had spent 48 hours organizing into a chronological presentation that would reconstruct 25 years of financial history. Edmund sat rigidly in his chair, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the circumstances, projecting an authority that everyone in the room suspected was about to be permanently undermined. Vivian had dressed as if attending a board meeting, her navy blue suit and carefully applied makeup suggesting someone preparing for battle rather than legal clarification. Richard positioned himself next to Diana Morrison, clearly hoping his legal reinforcement would provide protection against whatever revelations awaited. Harrison stood at the front of the room, his usual composed demeanor showing signs of strain that reflected 48 hours of discoveries that had challenged every assumption he had held about the Whitmore family finances. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of legal formality, "we are here to review documentation that affects the estate distribution we attempted to formalize earlier this week." Patricia activated her presentation, and the large monitor displayed a timeline beginning in 1995. "I want to start with Margaret Sullivan's financial position before she ever met the Whitmore family," she announced, her professional tone setting the stage for revelations that would systematically destroy the family's assumptions. The first slide showed inheritance records from the estate of Dr. Catherine Sullivan and Professor Michael Sullivan, Margaret's parents who had died in a car accident in 1994. Their combined estate, built on pharmaceutical patents and university investments, had transferred over $2.8 million to their only daughter, making 20-year-old Margaret Sullivan one of the wealthiest single women in Boston. Robert Chun leaned forward in his chair, his forensic accountant's eye immediately recognizing the significance of those numbers in 1995 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that inheritance would be worth approximately $5 million today, he observed. That level of liquid wealth would have provided substantial investment capital for real estate acquisitions. Patricia clicked to the next slide, showing Margaret's 1996 investment portfolio. Rather than simply managing her inheritance conservatively, Margaret had demonstrated sophisticated financial acumen by diversifying into growth stocks, international markets, and real estate investment trusts that had generated impressive returns throughout the technology boom of the late 1990s. Vivian's confident expression began to waver as she realized the woman she had dismissed as financially dependent had possessed serious wealth years before entering the Whitmore family orbit. This was a Margaret she had never imagined, a financial sophisticate who had managed millions of dollars with apparent expertise. The next series of slides documented Margaret's first business interaction with James Whitmore in 1998. Their initial meeting had occurred at a real estate investment seminar where James had been seeking capital partners for commercial property acquisitions. Margaret had not been a romantic interest seeking financial security, but rather a potential business partner with the liquid capital and investment experience James needed to expand beyond his modest family holdings. Patricia displayed the original partnership agreement between James Whitmore and Margaret Sullivan, dated 6 months before their first documented romantic relationship. The agreement established Margaret as the primary funding source for a joint venture targeting undervalued commercial properties in the Boston metropolitan area. Her initial capital contribution of $1.4 million had provided the foundation for what would become the Whitmore commercial real estate empire. Edmund's face had gone ashen as he stared at documentation that revealed his son's business success had been built on Margaret's wealth rather than Whitmore family acumen. The Cambridge office building that he had always considered James's first major triumph had been purchased entirely with Margaret's funds, using her credit qualification and her income verification to secure commercial financing. Diana Morrison was frantically taking notes, her property law expertise immediately recognizing the legal implications of what Patricia was presenting. If Margaret had been the primary funding source for property acquisitions, her legal ownership claims would be nearly unassailable under Massachusetts partnership and property law. Patricia continued with slides showing the systematic expansion of the Whitmore business empire between 1999 and 2005. Each major property acquisition had required Margaret's financial participation, either through direct capital investment, credit co-signing, or income qualification for commercial loans. The Burlington commercial complex had been purchased with funds from Margaret's liquidated stock portfolio. The Martha's Vineyard vacation house had been bought using proceeds from Margaret's family property sales in Vermont. Robert Chen was performing rapid calculations on his tablet. Based on these funding sources, he announced grimly, Margaret appears to have provided approximately 70% of the capital for all major property acquisitions during the empire's primary growth period. Richard felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized the business legacy he had assumed would be his inheritance had been built primarily with his stepmother's wealth. Everything he had attributed to his father's business brilliance had actually depended on Margaret's financial resources and investment expertise. The most devastating revelation came when Patricia displayed mortgage and loan documents for the Beacon Hill mansion. James Whitmore's income alone had qualified him for a maximum mortgage of $1.8 million, insufficient for the $4.2 million purchase price. Margaret's additional income, combined with her substantial down payment contribution of $800,000, had made the purchase possible. Vivian's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Her hands began trembling as she stared at documentation proving that the house she had assumed would be her inheritance had been purchased primarily with Margaret's money. The lifestyle she had enjoyed for 15 years, the social status that came with the Beacon Hill address, the entertaining spaces where she had hosted charity events, all had been funded by the woman she had treated with condescending dismissal. Patricia clicked to slides showing business loan documentation for Whitmore Development Corporation, Whitmore Property Management, and Whitmore Investment Partners. Each company had been established using Margaret's personal credit history and financial backing. Her signature appeared not as a courtesy authorization, but as the primary loan applicant whose income and assets had qualified the companies for business credit lines totaling over $12 million. Diana Morrison cleared her throat with obvious reluctance. Based on Massachusetts business partnership law, she said carefully, these documents suggest that Margaret has legitimate claims to majority ownership of all 3 companies. If her capital investments and ongoing financial contributions can be verified, which appears to be the case, then James could not legally transfer business ownership through his will without her consent. Patricia saved the most shocking revelation for last. She displayed recent banking records showing that even after James's death, Margaret had continued making payments on business loans, property taxes, and maintenance expenses for all family holdings. While the family had been planning their inheritance distribution, Margaret had been quietly ensuring that their assumed assets remained financially viable. The final slide showed the recent will modification that had attempted to reduce Margaret's inheritance to $50,000. Patricia's legal analysis was devastating in its clarity. This will modification attempted to distribute assets that James did not have the legal authority to transfer unilaterally. Based on the documentation we have reviewed, Margaret maintains controlling financial interest in approximately 85% of the total estate value. Edmund's commanding facade collapsed entirely. The patriarch who had presided over family business decisions for decades was confronting the reality that those decisions had been enabled by wealth that had never belonged to his family. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke. "Are you saying that Margaret legally owns almost everything we thought we were inheriting?" Harrison nodded gravely. "Margaret has several legal options. She can assert her ownership rights and reclaim properties where she has controlling financial interest. She can demand fair compensation for her investment contributions. Or she can choose to honor her late husband's wishes in whatever manner she considers appropriate." Margaret spoke for the first time since the presentation had begun. Her voice was calm and measured, carrying none of the triumph that her legal position would have justified. "I love my husband very much," she said quietly. "I supported his dreams because I believed in what we could build together. I never needed recognition or acknowledgement from his family, but I also never expected to be excluded from the legacy we created together." Vivian was crying openly now, her carefully applied makeup streaking down her cheeks as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculations. The woman she had mocked as a gold digger had actually been funding the gold mine. The lifestyle she had taken for granted had been subsidized by someone she had treated as irrelevant. Richard's legal mind was already calculating the catastrophic implications for his assumed business inheritance. "Margaret," he said desperately, "surely we can work out some arrangement that recognizes both your contributions and the family's expectations. Perhaps a partnership structure that maintains family involvement while acknowledging your ownership rights." Margaret smiled sadly. "Richard," she replied, "I spent 15 years trying to be part of this family despite being consistently reminded that I was an outsider. I funded your business ventures, subsidized your lifestyle, and supported your father's dreams while being treated as if I contributed nothing meaningful to family success." Diana Morrison was reviewing legal precedents on her laptop with increasing urgency. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said formally, "given the documentation we have seen today, you have the legal authority to restructure ownership of all properties and businesses according to your actual financial contributions. What are your intentions regarding the estate distribution?" Margaret stood up slowly, her dignity intact despite 15 years of family dismissal. "My intentions," she said, "are to ensure that my late husband's memory is honored appropriately, that his family understands the true foundation of their financial security, and that future decisions about family wealth are made with full knowledge of who actually built and funded the empire you have taken for granted." As Margaret left the conference room, the remaining family members sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that the woman they had excluded from inheritance consideration actually controlled the inheritance they had assumed was theirs by right. Their comfortable assumptions about family wealth and power had been systematically destroyed by evidence of financial reality they had never bothered to examine or acknowledge. 3 days later, Margaret requested a final meeting at the Beacon Hill mansion. The irony was not lost on anyone that she was now hosting the family in a home she had largely paid for, in rooms she had quietly funded, surrounded by furnishings purchased with wealth they had never acknowledged she possessed. The family gathered in the library where this entire revelation had begun, but the power dynamics had shifted so completely that the space felt transformed. Margaret sat behind the massive desk that Edmund had once used to project authority, her simple black dress replaced by an elegant navy suit that suggested someone preparing to assume control rather than someone accepting dismissal. Edmund, Vivian, and Richard occupied the chairs they had once used to celebrate their assumed inheritance. But their earlier confidence had been replaced by the uncertain posture of people who finally understood they were financially dependent on someone they had spent 15 years disrespecting. Margaret's voice was calm and measured as she addressed the family that had excluded her from their legacy planning. I asked you here today because I believe my late husband would have wanted his family to understand the complete truth about the empire we built together, she began. For 15 years, I chose to remain in the background because I loved James and wanted him to receive recognition for our shared accomplishments. She opened a folder containing legal documents that Harrison had prepared based on her instructions. However, I also cannot allow his memory to be diminished by the assumption that his success was built on inherited family wealth rather than the partnership we created together. The documentation you saw this week proves that James and I were true financial partners in everything we achieved. Edmund sat rigidly in his chair, the commanding patriarch reduced to someone waiting to learn the extent of his financial future. Margaret, he said carefully, I believe we all owe you an apology for not fully understanding your role in building what we have always considered family assets. Margaret smiled sadly. Edmund, she replied, your apology is appreciated, but what I needed was recognition 15 years ago when I was funding your son's dreams, qualifying your family for property purchases, and subsidizing lifestyle choices that my wealth made possible. An apology now feels somewhat convenient rather than sincere. Vivian had been quietly weeping since entering the room, her earlier arrogance completely shattered by the recognition of how cruelly she had treated someone who had been subsidizing her comfortable existence. Margaret, she whispered, I don't know what to say. I treated you terribly, said horrible things about you, dismissed everything you contributed. I was wrong about everything. Margaret's expression softened slightly. Vivian, she said gently, I understand that you were protecting what you believed was rightfully yours. But I also need you to understand that your protection was unnecessary because everything you valued was built on a foundation I provided willingly out of love for your father. Richard leaned forward with the desperate hope of someone trying to salvage something from complete catastrophe. Margaret, he said, what can we do to make this right? How can we move forward in a way that honors both your contributions and maintains some version of family continuity? Margaret consulted the legal documents Harrison had prepared according to her specifications. I have restructured ownership of all properties and businesses to reflect actual financial contributions, she announced. However, I do not wish to punish James's family for misunderstanding our partnership. I am prepared to offer each of you continued involvement in the family wealth, but under new terms that reflect reality rather than assumption. She slid copies of new legal agreements across the desk. Edmund, the Cambridge office building will remain under your management with a salary of $150,000 annually. The property legally belongs to me, but I believe James would have wanted his father to maintain dignified involvement in business operations he helped develop. Edmund's relief was visible as he realized Margaret was offering him continued financial security despite his years of dismissive treatment. Thank you, he said quietly. I promise you will have no reason to regret this generosity. Margaret turned to Vivian with an expression that mixed firmness with compassion. Vivian, you may continue living in this house for as long as you choose, with all expenses paid from family accounts. However, major decisions about renovations, entertaining, or property use will require my approval since I am the legal owner. Vivian nodded gratefully, understanding that Margaret was offering her continued comfort despite behavior that would have justified complete exclusion. I will respect whatever guidelines you establish, she said. I am grateful for any consideration after how I treated you. Richard received the most complex arrangement, reflecting both his legal expertise and his potential value to ongoing business operations. Richard, you will become Chief Operating Officer of all family businesses under my ownership, with a starting salary of $200,000 in profit participation that could reach $400,000 annually if you demonstrate competence and respect. The new structure gave each family member financial security while establishing clear authority that reflected actual ownership rather than assumed inheritance. Margaret had chosen magnanimity over vindication, but her generosity came with expectations that would prevent future disrespect. Over the following weeks, the family's understanding of their financial reality became public knowledge throughout Boston's social circles. Margaret's quiet strength and business acumen earned recognition that had been denied during her years of background financial leadership. Charity organizations that had politely tolerated her involvement while courting James's donations now sought her leadership for major philanthropic initiatives. The Whitmore business empire, now operating under Margaret's acknowledged ownership, experienced unprecedented growth as her financial expertise was finally applied openly rather than behind the scenes. Properties that had been managed conservatively under James's leadership were developed aggressively under Margaret's direction, generating returns that impressed even seasoned real estate professionals. Edmund found purpose in his new role as senior consultant, his experience valued, but his authority properly limited. Vivian discovered genuine satisfaction in supporting Margaret's charitable work, finding meaning in activities that contributed to community welfare rather than social status. Richard proved himself capable of respectful collaboration, his legal skills finally applied to advancing shared goals rather than protecting assumed privileges. 6 months after the devastating reading that had started this transformation, Margaret stood alone in Mount Auburn Cemetery, visiting James's grave. The simple headstone bore his name and dates, but she had added a small inscription that read together, "We built something beautiful." The flowers she placed were white roses, the same variety she had chosen for their wedding 15 years earlier. She told him about the family's adjustment to their new reality, about business successes that honored their shared vision, about charitable projects that would benefit the community they had both loved. Margaret Whitmore walked back to her car through the peaceful cemetery paths, no longer the dismissed second wife who had been excluded from family legacy planning. She had become the acknowledged architect of a financial empire, the respected leader of a business organization, and the generous matriarch of a family that had finally learned to appreciate her contributions. The November afternoon was crisp and clear, much like the day of James's funeral when this entire revelation had begun. Margaret drove home to the Beacon Hill mansion that she now openly owned, to the family that now properly respected her authority, and to the future she would build on the foundation of truth rather than assumption. Behind her, James Whitmore rested in peace, knowing that his beloved wife had finally received the recognition she had earned through decades of quiet strength, financial wisdom, and generous love. The empire they had built together would continue under her capable leadership, but now everyone understood exactly whose vision and whose wealth had made their shared dreams possible. Margaret had spent years in the shadows of family dynamics that dismissed her contributions, but she had emerged into light that revealed her true strength. The woman who had been excluded from inheritance consideration had become the architect of a legacy that would honor both her husband's memory and her own remarkable capabilities. Justice had been served not through vindictive revenge, but through the simple revelation of truth that transformed assumptions into acknowledgement, dismissal into respect, and exclusion into leadership.